All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. You know, I think back to the first website that I started building back probably 15 years ago or so. And it was really about content and putting content on the web. It wasn't about interactivity at all. All of the graphics that I had, the most interactive graphic I had and the richest graphic I had was the little shovel guy, the animated GIF that was doing that kind of thing. And as the web has matured, we've seen a lot more interactivity come. We've seen a lot more richer graphics, right? But a lot of those things sometimes have required a little bit of black magic to happen, or we've had to do server-side processing of all of our code in order to get those really rich graphics, really rich experiences, and really rich websites and web applications. But HTML5 really gives us the platform that we need to be able to build web apps that feel like they're native, that feel like they've got the power, the same experiences, and really have those awesome web apps that we expect. So we're talking today about getting started with HTML5. My name's Pete LePage. I'm a developer advocate at Google. And I'll let Ernest introduce himself.
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. My name is Ernest Delgado, and I'm also in the Chrome Developer Relations team, focused mainly on HTML5. Pete?
Awesome, thanks. You can follow us on Twitter, and we'll be spending a bit of time on Twitter today. As we're going through, please, if you haven't already, have a look at the Speaker Meter website and provide feedback as we're going. And don't forget the BootCamp IO and the Chrome Twitter hashtags as we're going through these things. The plan for today is we're going to talk about what is HTML5. We're going to dive into what we can do with it and how we can start using it today. This is really sort of a 100-level talk. But for those of you who have played with HTML5 before, don't worry. There will be a few good nuggets in here. There's going to be some really neat stuff. The other thing that I want to mention is that we really can't go through all of the new features of HTML5 in a single 1-hour session. We'd probably be here for the next 4 hours, and we'd get maybe half the stuff. So we just sort of picked a bunch of our favorites that we thought were the most interesting. All right? If you want to see more, we'll have some resources at the end that you can go and check out. As well, these slides and the code that we're showing today is going to be available to you after. So don't worry about scribbling down any notes or like anything, code snippets or anything like that. So the first thing I want to start with is, what is HTML5 and what does it mean? At Google, we think about HTML5 as the collection of web technologies that have really come to maturity in the last 2 to 4 years. So that includes things that give us a really rich development platform. As developers, that we can go and use some really rich APIs to provide offline access or offline storage so that I can store data on the user's computer without having to send it back and forth with cookies. Or that I can get access to things like device hardware, getting access to maybe geolocation for the user, or how their laptop is sitting, whether it's tilted, whether it's straight up and down, all of that kind of information. But it also gives us access to things that we can make our applications run faster as well. And so we're going to dive into those. And it gives us access to things that allow us to build more beautiful web apps. No longer are we limited to the sort of, oh, look, it's a white page with a couple of words on it, and it's not all that pretty. We can do some really rich, graphically intense stuff that we could never do before with video and audio and canvas and CSS styling. So the way we sort of decided we wanted to show you this is by building a web app that takes tweets from the Chrome DevRel team and visualizes them in this kind of neat way. It drops them down. So it's pulling all these tweets from Twitter, and it's using CSS3 animations to drop them. So all these guys here are getting drawn and using CSS3 animations. The older the tweet is, the more transparent it becomes. So you notice on some of these tweets, you can kind of see, on those ones you can see through it. This one, you can't see through it at all. So we're using opacity to set the age of the tweets. We're using geolocation to be able to provide information about where people are. If I have a look here, this tweet here, that's a little bit lighter on screen. As I make it mouse over it, it gets bigger. It's saying there's geolocation there. And in fact, we provide additional rendering of geolocation on these tweets. We also have notifications. I'm not going to turn these on right now because we'll have a look at these a little later. But we also have an ability to be able to search. This is, I think, one of the coolest things. So speech input. So I can click this little guy here. Free cake. Sure enough, there's all the tweets that include the words free cake. All right, the amount of code that I had to write to do that, not much. All right. Under the covers, we're using IndexedDB to store all the tweets so that even if you weren't online, you'd still be able to see all of these tweets. And we're using web workers to go and get the tweets and put them into the database. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ernest, who's going to talk about the stuff that we did for the rich user experience.
Thank you, Pete. So I'm going to show you some of these APIs that we've used for this app, and starting for speech input, which is the last one he demoed. And this is the shortest snippet that you're going to see today, because actually, to enable this feature, we only added this attribute to the input field that we already know. So the good thing is that the browser is giving us a lot of UI for free that we don't need to do with JavaScript. For instance, here we have this input field inside this bubble. And when we click on the microphone, there's this pop-up that you've seen that is going to tell us, OK, it's time to talk. I'm going to try to say free cake with a much worse pronunciation, of course. Free cake. OK, at least it recognized it. So we have these words here. But now we want to do something else. We also have an API that we can access from JavaScript and do more stuff. For instance, here, if we attach like an event to the input field and say when it changes, just trigger this function, the event object returns this list of results. And we can go through the list of results to do different stuff. I'm going to do the same test here with the free cake. Free cake. And I didn't say it very well. So it was the second guess, actually. The system understood that I said create, and the confidence for that was 0.2, so the confidence wasn't very high. If I try to pronounce it better, let's see. Free cake. So now it gets free cake and with a confidence of 0.8. So still we have a list of all the other guesses, like free games, free skate, and so on. But the confidence wasn't very high for that. This confidence, as well as the string, which is called the utterance, these are data that we're getting from this API. And when we're saying a word, this word is sent to the cloud. As it happens with our phone, the voice recognition, we don't need to do any local voice training to get accurate results. It used to happen that with a local desktop software for this matter. But now that we're using the cloud, we don't need that anymore. And that's really cool. So another feature we were using in the app is geolocation. And this is really useful to build your apps with customized content based on the location of the user. And we are just checking for navigator.geolocation to check if the browser is supporting this. And then using the watch position method, which is actually running in the background to check for the position constantly. And then in the position parameter, we get the coordinates latitude, longitude, and one that is not showing here on the screen, but it's the accuracy or something like that. That actually, if I run this demo, we're going to see. It says that access denied because we need to enable geolocation. We can do it here. I think that we could have done that from this app as well, because it needs to be user enabled by some checkbox. Show location here, yeah. Oops. I see. So help me here, Pete. I need to clear the results for that.
So of course, what we did earlier, we did a rehearsal to make sure everything was working, and we were like, oh, let's just deny access for now, so that way we can have it work properly when we actually go do the demo.
I'm going to create it here now.
Oops. helps clear that after you deny it.
Perfect. Now it should work. So let's refresh. So at least you can see the level of protection that the user has. So when we ask here for geolocation, it's both asking us in the butter bar, we are allowing now this feature, and it's saying us that we are at this position. Not very good, actually, because it says actually that that accuracy parameter that I told you before, it's saying that it's 22,000. So in the background, it's using like IP lookup or any information that the browser has, like Wi-Fi connection, like AP spots. So that's why it asks the user for permission for these kind of things. So as in all demos that you try live, it works bad, but try it at home and it'll be better. And the way we're using it here in the Twitterfall application is that he mentioned before that the tweets that have geolocation attached in that JSON object that you get when you use the Twitter API, we're highlighting them here in this list. So we're using this position of the tweet compared with our position in local. And if that person is very far, the tweet shows in this fold down here, like smaller or bigger. But only for those with geolocation. In this case, it would be like this tweet of Mike West. So how many people here haven't heard about Canvas yet? So, OK, not many. And it's not surprising, because it's one of the features that is being around for a long time in HTML5. And it's funny to see how it evolved over time, because it started with all these methods to make basic shapes and draw lines. And it has also other methods for transformations. And as you can see here in this drawing, it's rotated, but the edges are like kind of cut off. And this is because we're not rotating the whole canvas element, only the content inside. And obviously, the size, it was like wider and not as much as high. And that's just to understand that we're doing the modifications at pixel level. Also, when we rotate this image, there's no transition. We have to do like a for loop and do the animation by hand. That's why after this thing was kind of popular, there were many frameworks that were on top of that to kind of easy all this programming. Also, there's like a processing syntax wrapper for that. So there are many libraries on top of Canvas. But the power of this is really high. And also, we can use images or videos to import it in the canvas, get the frames, modify the pixels. And here, just as a proof of concept, we have these two images here, and just they have been imported inside the canvas just to place them. Not a big deal. But then we can export that with the data URL to any PNG or JPEG back to the image tag if we want. So if we go back to the Twitterfall app, another proof of concept that we put here was that right now the background is this CSS pattern. And if we enable like animated background, it's doing this fancy stuff that taking like some stars image, putting it on top with some opacity, also doing this color changing and this animation. And it was really complex to do that only with JavaScript or images. So programming that with Canvas is much easier. So if you keep in mind this rotation I did with Canvas, if we want to rotate the whole element, now we are able to do it with 2D transformations. So, and it's actually just from CSS. We just set some properties to transform and rotate like 90 degrees. But the cool thing is that if we combine that with transition, then we have the whole animation between the two states. And we don't need to do like in Canvas, like every frame redraw the whole thing. So in the transition, we're all just saying 800 milliseconds, and that's what it's going to last. But now it means that we are able to do it on any element. So if I hover this code, it's going to do it as well, just because I programmed it like that. But I could do it on the title or on the whole page if I wanted to. So these transformations are the ones that we used in the Twitter application to make this thing bigger. And actually, the code, I think I have the snippet here. These are the two states I was talking about. I'm saying like an initial state where there's no rotation at all, and a final state that happens when I hover that tweet using this CSS selection. And then we have the scale. That's why that tweet is getting bigger, and some translation just to make it like go not outside of the boundaries. And what happens here is that you see many lines because in CSS, when something new comes, there are like the browser prefixes that allows us to use that new feature in the browser. And later, when it becomes standardized, then we won't need that anymore. But at least when browsers implement things with different syntax or little differences, we are able to use that right away in the browser using these prefixes. There are also 3D transformations. These are a really cool feature and also one of the latest. And here, when we say rotation, we can specify on what axis we want that rotation. And if we want like an 80 degrees, it's going to flip whatever we have on the screen. And it's going to give like the impression of the 3D because we added this perspective parameter. So we didn't do anything here with 3D in this app. But if you pay attention to these slides, the way that they're doing the transition, they're doing this kind of 3D effect. That's where we're using the 3D transforms. So this is not meant to build like a whole 3D environment or a game. You have like the WebGL context in the Canvas stack. We're going to not talk about it because it's really a dense subject. But you have a specific talk on I/O tomorrow if you're more interested or if you're a game developer. And now let's make our site prettier. Because actually, for many, many years, we had those 8 fonts in our browser, and we were limited to those 8 fonts. And since you shouldn't be using Comic Sans for your site, we're limited to 7, 8 font types. So the cool thing to demo the web fonts that now with this feature, we have access to thousands of fonts, is to use this extension made by Pamela Fox. And it's pulling actually a list from an API that we have at Google. It's the Google Fonts API. And we have all these fonts that we can preview. And when we select it, anything on the page, like the code there, is changing. And we can say, OK, how it looks here on my site. And if we like this font for our site, then we can copy-paste this code and put it in the header. And boom, yeah, we have the fonts available already. The only thing is that if you want to host the fonts, because with this API, Google is hosting the font file for you. So if you want to get the true type and host it in your own server, just put it in a folder and then use this syntax in CSS. You say font family with the keyword that you're going to use in your spreadsheet, and then source with a link to wherever you put your font file. And actually here, I think you have seen already that this font is actually text. It's not any image replacement or any crazy hack that web developers used to do. And it's using this font for here. I think that the font for the text is also another one. So it makes, actually, designers are really happy with this feature now. And the last feature I'm going to show you in this section is web notifications. And the easier way to understand this feature is if you are using chat or any chat or email software in your desktop. But I wouldn't be surprised that all of you maybe are using web-based software for that already. But obviously, if you're using still like the desktop, you'll be familiar with the notifications you have on the top right on Macintosh and on the top bottom Windows. And it will be like kind of this similar to that. But what we're seeing here actually are screenshots of the web notifications because actually we want this kind of feature for our web apps. I'm going to show the demo first here because as it happens with geolocation, you need a specific permission from the user. And then we have to say that, OK, we're allowed to do that. That's because we don't want the user to get like spam or any pop-up from any random site. He needs to know where he's giving permissions to receive these notifications. So if we receive, let me see, for instance here, kind of trigger this notification here that it's showing both in the UI and this notification at desktop level. Now it's disappearing. So this notification that we get here, and probably we're going to get some more, is some of my teammates tweet now. We're going to get those tweets from now until the end of the talk. And it doesn't matter if I'm focused on that app or you have the browser minified. See, this thing is showing right here now, from my boss, actually. And I hope she's not watching me. The snippet for that is that we have this function. And when we call this function, we check if this site has permissions from the user to show notifications. And we're using this single method to pass 3 parameters, like a picture, a title, and the content. And actually, since we're doing it from Twitter, we have all that information from the JSON object of the tweets. There's another kind of notification that we're not showing here that is called, I think, create HTML5 HTML notification. So instead of 3 parameters, we pass one single parameter with HTML content, and that's going to show up in the notification. We're using also another method to show. And this is why the notification was hiding after a while, because by default, the thing is going to stay there until the user goes and closes it. But maybe we think that that's annoying for him because there are too many notifications. Up to the developer. So we set this set timeout, and it's going to close after a while. And actually, if you use Gmail or Google Calendar or even TweetDeck or some other similar app, you can enable this feature because they are already supporting that. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Pete to talk about some more features.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, sir. All right. So Ernest went through some of the sort of front end and user experience stuff that really allows us to make our applications feel like they run on the desktop. I'm going to take a look at some of the things that allow us to build applications that are more powerful, that give us more APIs than we've ever had access to before, and really allow us to do stuff that we couldn't do, or if we did, we had to, like, as I mentioned earlier, use some of that black magic, use some JavaScript that wasn't really meant to do something and animate something through this and that, and just not really pretty ways of doing things. As we started building this app, one of the things we realized we needed to do was store data. And we could have done that using cookies, but we wanted to store the configuration data for this application on the user's computer. We used web storage to do that. Web storage allows you to store name-value pairs of data. So it's, you've got the name, and then value is only a string. So we're using that to store the configuration information. There's 2 types of web storage that are available to us. There's session storage, which, like it sounds like, its lifetime is for the session. So you close that window, and you've lost access to it. And then there's local storage, and that lasts for until the user blows away their cache and clears out their browser. The way we're using this in our app is we've got a function called getSettings. And getSettings says var settings equals local storage, and it goes and tries to get the string from local storage. It then tries to parse that string into a JavaScript object. Because it's in there as a string, we want to get it into an object so we can handle it a little bit more easily. And so settings JSON.parse. Now, I've wrapped that in a try-catch block because what I want to do is say, hey, if you fail or if there's any kind of problems with this thing, we'll just go create a new set of settings, and then we're going to pass those back. Then to store that data into the configuration, we just do local storage, square bracket equals, and you give it the key, and then you give it the string that you want to put in. Again, because we're taking a JavaScript object, we need to turn it into a string because we can't just shove a JavaScript object into there. We're using JSON.stringify. And that allows us to get our configuration data into the app. So all of the information that's stored around which Twitter username and which user list we want to store, as well as how many tweets we want to show at any given time, whether we want to, if I turn the notifications off and reload the app, sure enough, the notifications are off. So every time we start the app, we start it in the same set of configuration that we used last time. We also wanted to store additional stuff on the user's computer that local storage didn't really work for. We wanted to store all the tweets that the user had seen on their computer. And so IndexedDB is a new set of, a new database object that comes as part of HTML5, and it allows you to store significant quantities of structured data. All right? Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to have a look at, but before we dig into this one at all, I just want to stop and sort of grab everybody's attention for one sec. A lot of the new APIs that you get access to with HTML5 are asynchronous. Put your hand up if you've done like an AJAX request and you know how you deal with sort of the asynchronous. Yeah. So you know how with that kind of thing, you have to give it a callback because the data might not be there when you go ask for it, and it's going to go and do stuff asynchronously? Well, many of the APIs that we get as part of HTML5 are that same way, all right? And IndexedDB is definitely one of those, and you'll see in a sec how we went about dealing with that. So to initialize a database with IndexedDB, I've created a function called initDatabase, and I give it a callback for DB ready. And that callback is called when my database object is ready. So there's a couple of things we need to do to initialize a database. First thing we need to do is set our version. So I've said var db version. The answer is 42. You can use a number. You can use a string. You can use whatever you want in there. As long as it's a legal JavaScript something, you can set it in there. All right? And then we say request IndexedDB open. And that opens the database. That says, hey, IndexedDB, go open yourself up for me. And here's where we have our first line where we need to deal with an async call, right? Because we don't know when that database is going to be ready. We can't just count on it being ready as soon as we call open. So we say request on success. And I've created a function here. And I've said database. Now, I've declared this as a global variable because I want to use it in a bunch of places. target result, and that gives me access to the database. Then I want to check to see if the database version that I've opened is the same one that I'm expecting. If it is, great. I'm just going to call database ready, and we're good to go, and we can start using it. If it's not, then we've probably made some changes to our database. Maybe it's a new instance of our application is running, or maybe we've created a new table, or we've changed some of the object types that are in there. So if it is a new version, we need to set the version to the new one. So we've got database set version, and we set it. And then again, same thing. We need to do an asynchronous call in and say ver.onSuccess, and I go and I create the table. So where you see here the object store name contains, so we check to see if it's already there. If it's not, we go and we say create the store, and we set the key path to the index that we want to use. And you can use whatever you want in your index here. And then we go and say, hey, we're ready. You can start using us. To get data from the database, same general concepts apply. So in this particular instance, all right, and this is the actual code from the app. If you actually go and look at our app and go view source, you're going to see this function with this exact code in there. So we've set an item callback, and we've set a completed callback. The item callback gets called on each item. So like we go and, in fact, use it to stick stuff into an array. And then we call back completed callback when we've done all of our looping through. Now, you're going to notice these 3 lines. These 3 lines are pretty much the basics of any IndexedDB request. First thing we need to do is do var trans database.transaction. All right, so we need to go get a transaction access into the database. And in this case, because we're reading, we're going to do a read-only request. All right, so we're just saying, hey, read-only. Then we need to go say store, trans, object store. We want to get access to that table, right? We want to say, hey, give me all of the items in that particular table. And then to get the individual items from there, store open cursor. Now, IndexedDB works via cursors. All right, so instead of like a SQL notation where you say select star from table tweets, right? This gives you a cursor, and it allows you to iterate through. It's almost like a for each kind of statement, so you run through. In our onSuccess, once we have our first cursor item, we go get our cursor. We check to see if our cursor is undefined, because we're done when we've hit the undefined. And we do the callback if we're done. And if we're not, we do the item callback. So we say, hey, I want to take you, and I want to just shove you into my array or do whatever you want. In our particular case, we're doing a couple of things. We go and as we pull the stuff back, we go and add it to this list on the right, and we add it to the items in the database. To add stuff to a database, similar concept. Those 3 lines are almost exactly the same, right? We need to go get our transaction access to the database. This time, we're going to change that first line. Instead of doing a read-only, we need to do a read-write because we want to put stuff into the database. We need to then get the store, get that table, and say, hey, we want access to the table. And then we can actually start putting stuff into the database with store.add. All right? Store.add adds a new row, effectively, is the way to think about it. There's also store.put, which allows you to replace an element. So if you've got 2 elements and you want to put one in and replace one with the other, you can use store.put. Now, I haven't put anything in my on success or on failure callback other than a console log in this particular case. But in something like this, more than likely, you'd probably just want to put some error handling in your on failure. And in your on success, you might want to deal with something that is, OK, we've already got the thing in there, or what have you. All right. Helps if I open the lid. How many of you guys have seen this dialog pop up, or a similar dialog when you're surfing around on the web? Yeah. Yeah, that dialog kind of sucks, doesn't it? One of the things with JavaScript is that JavaScript runs in the same thread as our UI, right? So that means if you try and do any complex JavaScript calculations, or maybe you get yourself into a race condition, or you're just doing something, or somebody else is doing something more than likely, because we'd never write code that did this. We're all, right? Yeah, all right. Because you're running in that same thread and you lock up, well, it feels like the browser locks up, and the browser pops that dialog up and says, hey, I'm sorry, this guy's taken too long. Do you want to kill it, or do you want to wait for it? So there's a new set of functionality in HTML5 called web workers. And web workers allows you to say, hey, I want to take this chunk of JavaScript, and I want to run it in a separate thread from my browser UI code. I want it to be completely separate. I don't want it to interfere. Just go off and do your own thing. Just come back and tell me when you're done. So that's what web workers is. And it's this really cool way to be able to go and run stuff off in another place. Now, I've got some sample code here, and I'll show you how we're using this in the app. But I wanted to sort of walk through the sample code to give a specific example of where you do some real complex calculations. So to calculate a Fibonacci sequence, if you remember those, add the 2 previous numbers. Well, those get really computationally expensive as your numbers start to get larger and larger, right? So you try and run that with a number of 100, and your browser's just going to go clunk and stop working, and it's not going to be pretty, right? So I created a Fibonacci calculator using a web worker. So the first thing we do is we say var worker equals new worker, and we give it a link to the JavaScript that we want it to go run. All right? So it's a separate JavaScript file, lives off in its own little world. And then, because it's running off in its own little world, the only way we can talk to it or it can talk to us is through post messages. All right? So we need to listen for any messages that it's going to send us. So we add an event listener that listens for messages. And we're just going to pop up a dialog. And then finally, we need to send it a message. We need to tell it to go do something. All right? So worker post message, and we send it 12. Then in our actual Fibonacci JS, so this is the actual code that's running in our worker, right? We need to listen for messages, right? Because, well, we're sending it stuff, so it needs something to listen. So self.onMessage, and we go and we start using our Fibonacci sequence. So we go and do that calculation. When we've finished, we do a post message to send back to our parent to say, hey, I'm done. Here's my value. All right? Now, the reason we need to do it this way is because it's running off in its own little world. All right? it doesn't have any other access to most of the things we're used to. It doesn't have access to the window object. It doesn't have access to the DOM. Doesn't have access to a lot of stuff. So the only way we can get messages back and forth is with the post message. So sure enough, this guy runs, and we get our result back with our Fibonacci sequence. Now, how are we using this in our application? In our index.html, we have a function called startWorker. All right? And that goes and it says, same thing we saw before, bar worker equals new worker, and it points to the script that we want to start running in its own little thread. We add our event listener that says, hey, anytime you get a message, I want you to send that message and handle it with new tweet handler. So that new tweet handler is going to go and handle any of the content that we send it from our worker. And then we tell our worker, all right, time to get started. You're good to go. Within the worker, again, same concept. Self.addEventListener. We listen for new messages. And we start a function that's going to go and read the tweet. So this is in our worker thread, this is what's actually going up to Twitter and saying, hey, Twitter, got any new messages for me? All right. Nope. OK, fine, thanks. Got any new messages? Oh, you do. Great, thanks. So it then takes that message and it sends it over to our application. Now, you'll notice I used a line here. Import scripts. Import scripts. Remember I said earlier we don't have access to the window object? We don't have access to the DOM? Means we can't go and do a JSON-P request. We can't create script elements in our DOM, so we can't have any of that stuff going. So we need a way that we can be able to insert scripts into our application. And so there's a method called import scripts, and it works synchronously. Right? So this one is not async. This is synchronously. So it goes up to Twitter, and I've just shortened the URL here just so that it would fit on the slide. But it goes up to Twitter. It requests the tweets. That then inserts the JavaScript that Twitter sends back into our worker, and then that code gets executed. All right? So that's how web workers work. They go through, they grab our information, off in their own little world, and they send messages back and forth. All right. I want to go to sort of some basic stuff for a sec, because I think this is one of my, it's the easiest part of HTML5, I think, but it's also one of my favorite parts of HTML5. HTML5 makes our markup and our markup much more semantic and much easier. How many of you guys have the HTML 4.01 doc type memorized? Right. You know, usually when I ask that, there's like 2 people who put up their hand, and there's probably 2 people who have a memory that good. I can tell you, I don't. Right? Like, I know it's doc type, and that's about as far as I stop. All right? I'm used to the tools inserting it for me. HTML5 gives us a new doc type that's a heck of a lot easier. Doc type, HTML. Much easier than that big, long, crazy thing. And this will stick all of the browsers into their most compliant rendering mode, giving us all of the HTML5 features. One of the other things that becomes easier is we've got this meta char set equals UTF-8. We don't have to go and put in all those big, long, complex name and value and content and all that kind of stuff. We've simplified and made our markup a lot easier. There's also a bunch of new semantic elements, and they went through when they were going and deciding which semantic elements to add by looking at all of the markup that you guys have all written over time. And they looked at what classes and what IDs appeared most often. Sure enough, things like header, footer, article, nav were the most common classes and IDs. So why not actually give those their own elements? They also changed the meaning of a couple elements. So elements that had a stylistic meaning in the past, they changed those to have a semantic meaning now. I think my favorite one of those is small. It's still going to render in the same way. It's still going to be small text, OK? But what's going to happen is instead of it rendering instead of it just having the visual meaning, it now has a semantic meaning. And that semantic meaning is the small print or the fine print that's on the bottom of a legal document, or maybe the fine print that's on the bottom of your web page. So it gives it a semantic meaning. There's also a bunch of elements that, while they haven't been deprecated, they've been obsoleted, if that's a real word. Okay? And they're still going to work. They're still going to render exactly like they did before. If you're using them in your markup today, they're still going to work. But the only thing that's really going to happen is your friends are going to look at your code and your friends will laugh at you. That's about it, right? And honestly, do we need a reason to get rid of the marquee tag? Like, come on, really? The blink tag? Things like center. You can do that with CSS styles. So that's why those elements are gone now. In our application, the way we actually use this is we created the application really only using 3 main sections. Across the top, we've got our header element, all right? And that just is an element that runs across the top, marks our header. On the left, we've got a section that contains all of our following tweets. And on the right, we've got an aside. And that aside is the tweets on the right. All right, form elements. Bunch of new stuff to make form work easier, right? So that if you've got input types, there's a bunch of new ones like, email, phone number, dates, times, and things to make validation significantly easier. One of the cool things about these new elements, think about like on a phone. If you're going to enter in a phone number, isn't it nice when the device actually shows just the keypad? So by doing that, you can not only provide functionality for the device, but you can also add placeholders and patterns. So let's take a look at our application for a sec. I'm going to pop this open. There's a couple of things that are going on. I'm going to take this text out here. Notice that there are a couple of things happened. This guy turned to some light gray text. I'm not sure if you can read it in the back, but it says username. That's a placeholder, right? If we want to do a placeholder in the past, we had to do that with JavaScript, and it was kind of a pain in the butt, because sometimes the JavaScript wouldn't fire at the right time, or the user would start typing before the placeholder got popped in, and then all of a sudden, oh, not only does the user have what they typed, but they also have the placeholder. It just got to be this big mess, right? And unless you had like awesomeness, coding skills, not exactly the most fun. So I'm going to put this back in here. There's also this range element that allows us to specify a range. There's all sorts of new ones. The code that we've got, all right, so there's what we've got for the placeholder. I say placeholder equals username. And so that placeholder just automatically appears. We've also got a required attribute. I want to point this one out specifically because this is something called a binary attribute. And the first time I ever used it, it goofed me up pretty significantly. Because a binary attribute is true if it's there. It doesn't matter what you set the value to. If it's there, the value is true. All right? If you want to go and set a value on it, you can. You can say required equals required. You could say required equals true. You could say required equals hi mom. All right? All of those are going to evaluate to true. What happens if you say required equals false? It's true. So keep that one in mind, because I kid you not, I probably spent half an hour one day when I first came across binary attributes, and I was just like, it's set to false. I know it's set to false. I'm looking at my markup. I'm using the developer tools, until I realized what a binary attribute actually meant. For the required attribute on form elements, what that's going to do is that's going to stop the form from being submitted unless the user has actually entered text in there. We've also got some new CSS selectors that allow us to provide much more visually intense stuff. So I can say, hey, input when you've got a focus, right? Or I could say input required invalid. I want you to have a different set of styles than when you have input required and valid. right? So that's why you saw the check mark or the little red box. We've got an ability to, just with styling, right? In the past, if we did this, we had to write some pretty crazy JavaScript to do this. We had to use somebody's library, or it just was one of those things where we didn't get the richness that we can do with CSS3. One of the other things that we wanted to do was provide a really fast experience, right? It's really important that as people are using web applications, that they just are fast, right? They don't want to be, oh, I click on this link, and then, you know, it's the web of the 1990s, and I'm on a dial-up modem, and, you know, I'm waiting for my page. We want things to be fast. Application cache allows us to cache our entire application on the user's computer. Now, you're probably sitting there going, well, doesn't caching just do that in general? And yeah, it mostly does. But you've probably only got a cache of maybe 50 or 100 megs, or maybe you've cranked it up and you've got a fairly big cache. But think about all the pages that you visit every day and how quickly that cache gets blown away, right? You've looked at so much stuff that you've cleared that cache out. Now you go to that application and it's got to re-download everything. Well, that kind of sucks. With app cache, you can actually say, hey, I want you to store all of the data about my application on the computer. The way you do that is in the HTML element, we need to add a manifest file. That manifest file is a file that's served from our server that says, hey, this is the stuff that you should cache locally on the user's computer. In the actual cache file, it's got a particular format. You got to say cache manifest. You don't have to put a version in there. I'd recommend it because the way that the browser knows whether your application has been updated is by looking for changes in that file. All right? So you may change one of your index.htm, all right? But the browser's not going to bother to go check to see if index.htm has been updated because it's cached locally. So that's why you need to change the version. It'll go up every time. It'll try and get this app cache file and do that. One thing to just sort of call out, because, again, one of those little things that I fought with for about 20 minutes one day. When your server serves the app cache file, it needs to be served with the MIME type of text cache manifest. All right? So you either need to set that in your htaccess or however you're doing that. You need to go do that. There's also a bunch of JavaScript APIs that allow you to go and really get programmatic with your app cache so that you can update the application at specific times. Maybe you only want to update it when the user first starts the application. Maybe you want to ask the user before you update it because you're making some major changes or a breaking change or something like that. So you've got a set of JavaScript APIs that really allow you to go through and be much more powerful with app cache. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ernest to talk about some of the tools and resources.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to go really quick through this. And now that we've seen APIs that we can use in our web app, we may want to start coding, but not doing it from scratch. So it's worth mentioning some tools here that will help us to do that. The first one is boilerplate. With boilerplate, you can go there and get the files that actually you would use as a template for your app, and it's at a different level. So there's like an index.html with all the header and the basic stuff that you need, so you don't need to worry about it. It also, at JavaScript level, has like the includes that if you want jQuery or the analytics snippet in your page, you have that there as well. And at CSS level, there are many tweaks as well that you'll have like the recent CSS. You'll have that template there. Or for instance, media queries. Who in the audience knows media queries? Not many. It's just like a syntax to make your layout of the page change depending on the device that is looking at your page. So if it's a mobile browser, you can say, OK, from this width to this other width, change the layout to adapt to that screen. Also, there's a list of what we call polyfills, because when you start coding these APIs, you might not have the support in all browsers that you want to support. And I think I repeated support twice. But then these polyfills are kind of JavaScript shim that it's looking for a workaround. It's actually taking care of that workaround 100%. So the perfect polyfill lets you write that feature in modern syntax, and the polyfill is going to manage that to make that feature work in the browser. So it's possible that not all the features have fallbacks for all browsers. So that's when in your code, you should maybe do like some fallback case or graceful degradation. But instead of looking for the browser version, which is not a very reliable technique, it's better to do like feature detection. And for that, you should use, or you can use, Modernizer, which has this necessary syntax that you can put in your if statements. And if that feature is supported, do something. Otherwise, do the fallback. If you want to take a look at the growing support that all browsers are having now with HTML5 features, go to this site. It's really cool. It has all the tables and version numbers, and green if that feature is supported, caniuse.com. And another interesting tool that we've been using for a long time, maybe in other browsers, is this kind of debugging tool. In case of Chrome, it's called like the Chrome developer tools. And tomorrow, I think, today? Yeah. OK, so today there's a talk from Paul Iris going through all the details, the things you can do actually in this debugger. That there are things that I even didn't know. And the cool stuff here is that it has the capabilities to debug features like web workers or app cache that it was very difficult to debug if that wasn't supported, because web workers has a separate JavaScript file. So this debugger is actually prepared for that. Some resources that we are maintaining with sample code, tutorials, demos, in HTML5rocks.com. A couple of books that are quite interesting, Bruce Lawson and Mark Pilgrim. And I think that's it about resources. So I'm going to pass it over Pete to wrap up the presentation so you all can go eat. That's
awesome. So I'll just talk quickly about Chrome Frame. If you've not played with Chrome Frame before, super useful utility if you're stuck on older versions of IE for any specific reason. Chrome Frame will allow you to run HTML5 applications within Chrome Frame. So we've talked about some of the great APIs and application level support that HTML5 gives you. And we've also talked a lot about some of the really cool rich user experience stuff that we can really start building with HTML5. I'm really excited to see what you guys start building in terms of web applications. This is really our opportunity to change the web from being a bunch of web pages and websites to really being web applications that really just change the way we think about the web and what we do on it. So I encourage you guys to go start playing with this stuff and go using that. There's a couple of sessions today. There's the free cake session that also goes into HTML5 development with Chrome developer tools. The 2-hour hands-on lab. Really cool. As well, there's the building and publishing apps for the Chrome Web Store at 4. The rest of the week, whole bunch of really awesome stuff. If you make it to one session that is my favorite, the showcase for web devs, Wow and the How. Really, really cool session. I've seen some of the demos these guys are doing. Blow your pants off. With that, I want to say thank you guys very much. Please go fill out an evaluation form. And thank you. We'll open it up to questions now, but I know that some of you seem to be really hungry, so feel free. But we'll stick around and answer any questions you want. Thank you.